I'd hoped Jamie Jonkel could be here to discuss bears. This is the time of year when they're pretty active, and Jamie had some health issues he's dealing with. So Eli, who lives in Grant Creek and helps Jamie, would have helped, but presumably he's out wrestling bears. So, the key is, please don't put trash out before Thursday mornings. If you're in the city, that's the rule. If you're in the county, it's good sense. We just don't want to invite bears into our neighborhoods, either by feeding bird feed or hummingbird feeders or leaving our trash out, except the morning of pickup. So that's the key for bears. So we'll sort of knock that off the agenda real early. We've had a new addition to the agenda for which I'm very thankful. And you'll want to remind me to call on the Friends of Grant Creek Wildfire Risk Task Force. They've got a draft of a Grant Creek Fire Management Plan that they're having the board review, and it'll be available for review by agencies later this summer. So that's good news. That's preparing for a future that has to include fire if you live in Grant Creek. Now, Saturday, there was a great work project up on the Bluebird Trails. I hope you've used the Bluebird Trails since it's been officially opened. And there was some pretty wildlife unfriendly fencing along the boundary with the Republic Services and this hotel. It had sheep fence on the bottom and then barbed wire on top. And of all the possible combinations of wire that wildlife faces, that's the most dangerous, the most likely to catch them and kill them. So that wire was removed, and there's going to be wildlife friendly fencing put on that boundary. So that's great news. The other part of that I just want to thank Montana Snow Bowl, because they provided a permanent public easement to allow folks to park in their parking lot and access the trail. In fact, if they didn't allow access, the city's 120 acres would just be abandoned up there because there's no other way to get there. And so that donation of a permanent public access for parking and slipping across the short length of their property before you hit the city's property up the hill is really important. Without that, there would be no open space publicly available other than the Grant Creek Trail and all of Grant Creek. So many thanks. Andy Morris from Montana Snow Bowl is here tonight. He'll be discussing some of the challenges they have in that parking lot. And I want to introduce Kalina again, just so that she can set up some ground rules for this.
Why would you want the audio off? You want.
Okay, hi, yeah, so my name is Kalina Pritchard. I'm the neighborhood specialist at the city. We just really am excited that everyone came out today in person and online, like I mentioned. But before we begin, I wanted to kind of go over some ground rules to help guide our discussions and make sure that this is a smooth conversation, especially as we dip into the hybrid format. So we consider it a privilege to present and listen to diverse views. It is essential that we treat each other with respect, and in that we expect that participants will be recognized before speaking. We will have a few presentations and we'll save questions for after the presentation is finished. At that time, we will ask for questions. Please raise your hand either virtually or in person, and I will make sure that we'll get to most, if not all, of the questions. Everyone is encouraged to participate. When you speak, please state your name and where you live if you are interested. It's helpful to know who is speaking during a public meeting, especially for folks online and vice versa. We really want to make sure that we're listening to and respecting other points of view while also seeking first to understand, not to be understood. During these meetings, we want to make sure that we're engaging in active listening, so please refrain from any side conversations. If you think you might forget a question or idea, please feel free to write it down. And then we're hoping that we're just going to have some concise statements. This is an evening meeting, so we want to be mindful of everyone's time. And then finally, we further expect that participants will refrain from disrespectful displays, which I hope wouldn't happen, but any profanity, personal attacks, signs, heckling, things like that. Any folks who don't observe these may be asked to leave the premises, but I'm hoping that we don't get to that point today. So hopefully these ground rules can guide our discussions tonight, and hopefully everyone can participate. So with that, we'll move on to our first agenda item, which is Andy Morris.
You want me to stand over here?
Yeah, I mean, wherever.
Okay. Well, I didn't know if there was a mic or something like that. Hi, so Kevin and Bert just asked me to come and I guess have a discussion with the parking lot, the dirt parking lot north of the town pump that's owned by my family's business, Montana Snowball, and in particular the RV and fifth wheel parking that's going on there. I'm sure as you would guess, it's a frustrating situation for us as well. And sometimes we're able to deal with people that are trespassing effectively, and they're able to just move on. And through our generally our efforts, what we do is we post on their vehicle. If a certain amount of time has gone by that they haven't responded to the post, then we'll call the police. Generally, I have the police come and issue them a warning for those who are there. And then, and recently, my most recent calls, I've tried to escalate a little bit and say, okay, if they've been warned, then we would like you to cite them for trespassing. It's not a foolproof plan because if the people aren't there, then there's nobody to cite. We can't really tow the vehicles, those kind of vehicles like the one that's been there for quite a while now. The towing companies won't tow them. There's a liability risk also moving somebody's personal property like that, which is another issue. But for us, the main problem is it's private property. So the police are only they'll respond when we call, and they'll respond to a kind of a specific incident, and then it's we need to call again if the issue isn't resolved. And so it can be very difficult. So when we have someone, the person that's there, I think that's on the south end, the southeast end of the parking lot up against the hill, that person's been there for, I don't know, you guys probably know better than me because I don't live in the area, 5 weeks, but he was here in the winter as well. We've had multiple conversations with him, put notices on his car, the police have talked to him, and he's just decided that he's not going to leave until, I don't know, until we escalate it, I guess, further. So that's kind of the situation we are with that person. And then looking ahead, really my hope, and what I've communicated to the police, actually, my hope was having that public easement in place, having the public being able to use that parking lot would deter people from staying there. And then I've communicated to the police that, this is having public access like that heightens the, the risk. And that, I feel that there could be a safety concern. You have families and children using that. So it's wholly inappropriate place for people to be using as temporary accommodations. So, and so hopefully with the police, maybe we can further the discussions and coming up with a more, what's the word for it? Maybe a stronger presence, I guess, perhaps they can, it's a public easement there, so perhaps they feel comfortable going into the public easement. Right now, when I drove by, there was an RV in the public easement area. I don't know if they're utilizing the trailhead or if they've been staying there overnight, but I would feel like that should be an area where the police could come on and without me having to call them previously to tell them, hey, this particular vehicle is there, they could come on and have them move on. So that's one thing, maybe a more, which we've tried to avoid doing, but another thing would be fencing off the remainder of the lot that's not public easement. I don't think, I'd rather not do that. I mean, obviously it's expensive for us. It would need to be removed when we use the lot in the winter, but, and also that lot gets heavily used, not just by people using the Bluebird Trail, but, for rafters and all kinds of uses. And most of those day uses were absolutely fine with people utilizing the lot for that. So, yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. People have comments or concerns they'd like to tell me. I'm here to listen. So, yeah.
Do you have signs over there that say no
Yes.
overnight parking?
Yes.
Because I haven't looked very close, but we drive by it all the time.
Yeah, we say that you'll be towed if you're there overnight. Yeah, I think that, the people that utilize these spots, they know the game. They know that it's difficult. If you're willing to be obstinate about it, it's hard. It's hard to have people move on. Most of the time, I would say probably over 90% of the time, when somebody's approached and you just tell them directly, please move on, they leave. But we have someone like this guy who, as I said, we've had multiple conversations with him. He's just decided that it's he has some right to be there. So.
Amy, I'm Scott McLarson. I'm the president of Prospect Meadows Homeowners Association. I just want to express our gratitude for doing what you do to keep it as thinned out as possible. Because I feel like once one shows up,
Yeah.
two shows up, it
Right.
becomes known as a place where you can camp. And
Yeah.
It gets bad quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it just draws in bad stuff into the area. So thank you for what you do to keep it as good as you can. And I know we were working with you a couple years, maybe it was a year and a half ago, to maybe do some fencing.
Yeah.
We were gonna sink some poles. Is there any more thought to make it, we weren't gonna fence the lot off, we were just thinking about making it a little less inviting to maybe pull an RV in there. Is there any more
Yeah.
thought to that?
Well, we haven't talked about it much since then. I guess it's hard because the way that the way that easement is lined out, and the way that it would be hard. It would be hard to do. It would be a large area to cover. It could be something that we would look at again, but again, it's also the other issue is how that whatever is there, how is that going to work in the winter as far as plowing and making, because it's not, at this point in time, we don't have a parking attendant down there, but anyone that's frequented Snow Bowl, particularly this year, realize that parking lot is an important part to our winter operations, and it's going to play an integral part in whatever we're doing in the future as far as alleviating traffic, vehicle traffic on the mountain. So, any kind of structure that goes in there, needs to be able to work with making it as flexible as possible. So, yeah, we're certainly open to looking at again, and it would be nicer than, we're taught, it'd be nicer than putting up a semi, just basically a high chain link fence. I don't think that anyone really wants to look at that, but yeah, it is a tricky position when somebody particular, like this guy has just decided that he's not gonna leave, so. And you did bring up a good point, like, we try and make ourselves, you know, Kevin has my cell phone and my email, and I try and be as responsive as I can when people let me know. And I don't live up here, I live in the Lower Rattlesnake, so in the off season, I'm very infrequently up and down this road, so, you know, I don't necessarily know what's going on, but that's a critical thing when you have 2, 3, 4 RVs to get somebody out there like quickly, because that helps. So I appreciate you guys reaching out to me and letting me know, because I'm happy to make the call.
So really quick, we have 2 things online and then we'll come back here. So we did have a comment from Pam that just said she was visiting friends in San Diego last winter, walked by a convenience store several times, and she had noticed opera music being played outdoors 24/7 to deter camping, and it was effective. And then we have a question from Tony. Tony, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi there, just checking you can hear me in the room?
Ooh, just.
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know if anyone else can. I can repeat the question.
Yeah.
No worries. Okay, my question is this. As somebody who's drives by there a couple times a day, as I'm sure most of us do that are at this meeting, you can kind of see the problem people and you can see the non-problem people. And it sounds like what we need to do, or maybe explore, is working with our elected officials in the police department to deal with, you know, the heavy tow that would have to happen with this one particular person. And, you know, I do appreciate that you give a little bit to those who are weary travelers. I oftentimes will see a couple of semis parked in the dirt lot, but of course they're gone by the next day because they're in transit. So, and of course, I can't speak to, I do see several cars that are parked there multiple days in a row, but I assume they're either your employees or somebody who has not yet reached your radar, and you're letting them park there for extended periods of time. I think part of the benefit of living in Montana is those special case scenarios where you're like, hey, this is somebody who has a quick need, but it sounds like this one particular person, and perhaps others in general, are taking advantage of this. And, you know, is this the type of situation where we just need to mobilize and not necessarily make an example, but this person has obviously been warned, they've been talked to, and they've decided to roll the dice. So if we have to hit them hard, we hit them hard, and, you know, and then hopefully he'll move on or move to somewhere else, or, you know, become a problem elsewhere.
Yeah.
Please restate what he said, would you?
Yeah, well, he was just saying that perhaps with this particular person, that maybe more aggressive action could be taken, and maybe the community could help in that. And that, you know, that is one of the, you know, the police, to my understanding, they're not going to respond to somebody that's not the property owner with dealing with the property. But one thing that is very helpful, that they're most effective when the person is there. So if people see that the person is there, that's the time to deal with the problem, because that's when the police can have that face-to-face conversation. That's the first, when I call them, that's the first thing they ask. Are you there? Is the person there? And they'll still sometimes go do a check, but they're much less likely to go out there and you know, when they don't know what, you know, they're just wasting their time to go to an empty vehicle, because they basically have nothing that they can do, I guess.
So I apologize for jumping in one more time, but so from what I understand is, without the person being there, it's not that they can't, it's not because it's not on a public roadway, they can't cite the vehicle for trespassing, they can't cite the vehicle for a parking ticket?
Right, yeah,
Okay.
that's my understanding of it too. And I don't know what I mean, I can't speak to how the city deals with public complaints on private property, you know, in these kind of situations. I really can't speak to that. But on the other hand, I know just from my conversations with the police that they, you know, they, of course, because of the constraints on their services, they prefer, you know, they want the person to be there, and that's when they can do the most. And I've like I said, my last conversation with them, I said, you know, I would go ahead and cite them for trespassing, and so that's, you know, that's what they would do, I assume in that situation.
So I can answer a little bit on what can the city do
Mhm.
to, for complaints, and, I chatted with the code compliance officer, and if you ever have any questions, you can reach out to the code compliance of the city under community planning, development, and innovation. Her name's Charmel Owens. But if it's on private property, there isn't much that code compliance can do. There's no enforcement that is held with her, so it would be trespassing with the police. And if it's this kind of goes into, Greg Thomas talks about health risks. And so maybe if the police would take more notice if it was approached in this fashion. If it's more of a health risk, you could still do a complaint form with the code compliance. And it might be sent to the health department. And the health department can maybe address some of those concerns in a different way that code compliance can, even if it's on private property. So I think that's to the extent that I don't know if Myrtle, you have any.
That's what I know as well.
Okay. Okay, back there.
Yeah, thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. And this is a big concern for a variety of reasons. And I know this seems like an intractable situation, but as Scott was saying earlier, where there's one, there's usually, you can count on 2 or 3 in the near future. And people rotate in and out of there. So I think one of the solutions is, other than in this particular situation where the guys basically say, I'm standing and I'm thumbing my nose at you, the best thing to do is to be on top of it as quickly as possible. And I have one other question for you. What was the cause of the fire in the mobile home, the RV that burned on your property? Was that ever determined? Was it, God forbid, a meth lab that exploded?
To my understanding, it had something to do with the heating source that they were using outside of the vehicle. I don't know. I never saw the actual police report, and even, you know, I don't know if my father requested it or not. I guess as long as there wasn't you know, some kind of criminal action being filed, that maybe they would release the report, but that if there is any kind of investigative, they're not going to release that even to the property owner, because it's, you know, pending the criminal action. But I'd say the short answer is no, I don't know exactly the cause of it. Kevin, did you have it?
Yeah, Andy, I'm Kevin. Thank you for coming. And I want to remind everyone, this has been a challenge for a couple of years. And I've gotten engaged because of the cleanups that we've met, several volunteers, and we've interacted with the campers, asking them what's keeping them there, you know, helping direct them to resources, giving them notice, letting them know it's not authorized to be there. And so just in the last week, 8 or 10 of us have formed a public safety task force that we'll be talking with you more about later to hopefully ramp up efforts, be more organized, mobilized, as you say, to help you and help the city arrive at a reasonable solution, because the last couple of years it's been unreasonable. And the fire is a great example of that. And a sofa appearing at the trailhead yesterday is an example of that. And so I hear what the city's saying about limitations, but there might be a better opportunity now that you've extended sharing that lot with the city for that trailhead.
Well, I would think so too.
To combine efforts. And then more eyes on the area by just engaged, involved neighbors. I think, I'm optimistic. We're not going to solve it tonight, but after tonight, I think we can put a better plan together.
I mean, I would be curious to hear what the city does at other parking lots that, you know, around town. Like I live in the Lower Rattlesnake, so I'm up on Waterworks all the time. They just built this beautiful parking lot up there, and I don't see any, I don't see any RVs up there, so, you know, it'd be a nice spot too. But, so, you know, I think something like that, having a presence where, you know, if it's, there's a possibility that the police officer should have should have access to that public easement as well without needing their permission, I would assume, so, yeah.
How big is the public easement? I guess I should know this, but I was under the impression it's only for
not
a
that
number of cars that can park and use the entrance to the trail, right? It's not very big.
It's not very big. I mean, you know, like, without having a map, it's hard to describe, but it basically takes up not even, but maybe roughly the northeast quarter of the lot, but not even that much, maybe, you know, smaller than that, but it's just that northeast portion along where that trailhead is, maybe extends maybe 50 feet each way from that, you know, where they erected the trailhead. So it's not big, but still, you know, like there's an RV in there right now, kind of taking up basically the whole, you know, northern portion of the easement. So, and maybe they're just out walking their dogs on the trail. I don't know. But I think, you know, we're happy to look at any ideas. You know, any kind of fencing, you know, or some kind of post or something like that. We need to look at it in a way that's not going to be disruptive to parking there. That would be our main concern. But I also think that in more actually drove by there with the hopes that I would be able to call the police again and see, but I'll call them on my way out as well, and maybe I'll get lucky. Someone will be there, but I'll be sitting there, so I'll have that. But I think that, you know, being able to reach out directly to me and you know, it doesn't take much to call the police and have them come over. So, and maybe if we're calling them all the time, then maybe they'll realize that they should, you know, that it should be something that they could, you know, patrol or something, take a look at going up and down the road.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Sure.
Andy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's greatly appreciated. And it's a tremendous service. The rafters and the skiers and the hikers, we all benefit from having day use access there. And if we could just find a way to make the system protect that space from unauthorized camping, we're winning. So,
May I make a comment? I'm sorry, I came in late, and so I may have missed some of the other comments. But to the point about nobody squatting on waterworks, because it looks like somebody cares about that place. The parking lot doesn't look like anybody cares about it. It's people help themselves.
okay, so the comment, just for those who are in Zoom land, is that there is no problem with waterworks, and part of the reason is that it's clear that that land is owned. There's eyes on it all the time. Now, my hope, just so you know, was that when that easement went in, the eyes at the northern end of the lot would protect the southern end of the lot, but that has not happened. The eyes at the northern end are not protecting the southern end of the lot. The southern end of the lot is still seen as unowned, unoccupied, available to be taken. And I see that as the problem. And how do you change that? How do you make that lot look like it's owned, like it's taken, like you cannot trespass there? Well, one way would be you could pave it. Well, that's a pretty expensive option, so I don't expect that to happen. Another way would be that you could have posts on either entrance, and you could have ways for people to get through those posts between signs that say no overnight camping. And there would be signs on every post that say no overnight camping. And, you know, I think it would take a far more brazen person to then set up camp and refuse to leave in such a setting. So I don't know really what's affordable. You know, the city, it took a whole lot of money for the city to do that waterworks development. That's pretty big investment. And Snowbowl monitors the way it invests money in its ski area and has, if you've driven the road from Grant Creek all the way to Snowbowl over the last 20 years, you've seen that that road has improved incrementally and over a very long period of time. And, you know, I hope that that lot can improve the same way. But, you know, thank you for your comment. I'm sure Andy's heard it and probably thought about it. I do feel we need to move on. I've got some really good things that we have the opportunity to discuss tonight that deal with our shared values that are very positive. And so I don't want to continue this discussion right here, but we can continue it elsewhere. Now, pedestrian crossings at Stonebridge and Expo Parkway. Okay, we've got a nice Bluebird trailhead. We've got buildings under construction right now at Grant Creek Village. We've got a number of 4-story apartments there already. And how do we go about getting the pedestrian crossings that we need to keep us from killing the pedestrians on Grant Creek Road and to keep them alive, okay? Because neither one's good. We don't want to kill them and they don't want to die. So the development agreement for the Grant Creek Village, my apologies if that was just too silly, but I mean, hey man, we go through this every day and there's a lot of people now that have to come across that road and it says 45 miles an hour. Everywhere you look at it, if you look, it says 45 miles an hour. It's not a good package. So anyway, the Grant Creek Village development agreement between the city and the developer requires that the developer provide those 2 crossings when 193 units have been permitted. Well, there's no need to do it now because only 187 have been permitted. So the developer has a permit request in for another 40 units, but the city has not acted on that request. And the reason is that the city asked the developer to improve, rework the traffic study. And if you can think back a year or two to the great battles of traffic studies, we had the battle was joined several times on the traffic study by the Friends of Grant Creek primarily. And so those concerns, the city's concerns, were sent to the developer. A new traffic study has been prepared and the city received it on March 24th. Now, I'll begin quoting Kevin Slobart, the city engineer for surface transportation, who says the updated study adequately addresses both the city's and also Friends of Grant Creek's engineering consultant comments. He also said, city staff are working on identifying the appropriate infrastructure needed to mitigate the development's impacts to the transportation system. Once we finish identifying the mitigation and work with the Grant Creek Village developer on those mitigations, then we'll look to finalize the study. Meanwhile, the city has approved ready for construction plans for both crossings. So whenever all of these little wheels turn, there's nothing holding up construction of those crossings. So stay tuned. I'll certainly stay in touch, and I will expect to hear back from Kevin Slobart once that study has been finalized. They've given it to the developer, and then presumably it will be available to the public. Now, is Deb Fasnacht here? Okay, she's not. Okay, so I'll just say that the Watershed Education Network has long been very active in the rattlesnake. And for instance, they have citizen science in which they study the aquatic insects in Rattlesnake Creek. And they've had more recently a targeted study in which they're monitoring the area that was behind the dam that's been removed to see how the recovery occurs. So citizen science, they're in there, they're doing it. It's then available to the city, to others, and they will begin putting some energy into Grant Creek. And just so as you know, the Clark Fork Coalition has put a lot of energy into Grant Creek. And we're going to hear that in great detail. So, so I won't have to talk about what the Clark Fork Coalition is doing, because I'm sure Seamus won't overlook it. So now I get to introduce Seamus. So what a gift to have someone come to the University of Montana and study environmental studies. You know, we've had so many of the environmental studies graduates who've just done incredible things for our city. And Seamus fits right in there. He spent 2 years walking up and down Grant Creek. He had to get permission. You know, that took 4 years. Well, I exaggerated, but yeah, it's no small task to walk up and down Grant Creek with permission. It wouldn't be so hard if you didn't get permission, but he got permission. And then because he feels that environmental problems have social components, how novel. He thought, well, maybe I need to talk to the people along Grant Creek. So he's talked to a number of the people in this room finishing his master's degree. Well, you know, most students, they get their degree and then they're out of here and they're making the big bucks somewhere else, you know. So good luck, Grant Creek, good luck, Montana. See you later. Well, Seamus stuck around, and the Clark Fork Coalition found a home for him. And for the past year or so, there's been a working group established to try and figure out, are there ways Grant Creek can be improved? And I'm going to get out of here right now and turn it over to Seamus.
Thanks, Bert. Thanks for that. Yeah, very generous. Haven't done anything yet. That was for Bert. Thanks for that generous introduction. I'm going to work on some tech here. And yeah, I really enjoyed just kind of getting to know people. Good to see some new faces, but some of the people in the room have heard this from me many times. Let me just share my screen and hope this gets us there. Let me take a second. I won't rely too heavily on the PowerPoint today. I want to make sure everyone on Zoom can get there. But yeah, as Bert mentioned, I mean, I've worn a couple different hats in rooms like this, and also sort of throughout the process, and that's been important to me too. Right now, I'm working for the Clark Fork Coalition as a temporary employee, supporting their work. They put a lot of effort directly into it. Lily's here as well, and Will McDowell of the Clark Fork Coalition has also put a lot of time into this. And of course, it's also due to people who have just kept the conversation going long before I got to Montana a couple of years ago. Bert, many in the room. So this is really, you know, I'm just hoping to tell part of the story that extends well beyond me today. I titled this Restoring Grant Creek. I'm going to present mostly what came out of my thesis, talk a little bit about what the work that's been going on in the community currently. I call it restoring. Some of you have heard the term ecological restoration. You know, this is sort of a play on that, and I'll get into sort of why. And then we have these relational dynamics, which I won't go into as much because it's a little too academic, and I don't want to, you know, impose that on you today after the end of a long day. And let's see if we get this going. Today, I do want to give a little personal background that shows up. Talk a little bit about ecological restoration, go into the site, which, you know, as many of you may or may not know, Grant Creek extends far beyond the interstate, where it kind of goes underground, goes into the culvert. Talks about the findings, and then maybe have a little activity, something that may give you a chance to talk to your neighbors about restoring, that concept of restoring. And then, yeah, again, as I mentioned, talk about community restoration too. I want to lead with this personal background because I've found it so important as I've met people around Grant Creek to just be, transparent about who I am and kind of be aware and reflective on who I am and what I'm bringing to this. I grew up on the central coast of California. I'm not sure why that's not showing. Grew, a passion for the outdoors and the local places there, just by wandering, exploring, and getting to know the area. This is a restoration project. I returned after my undergrad and worked in a off-highway vehicle park where there'd been a lot of degradation, and there was restoration as the solution. This is just a weird looking picture of all the straw we were about to spread over this was about 25 acres site. You can see my friend here in the back, just kind of wondering what we're all doing. And it was just kind of an amazing, huge project, really aspirational, really complicated, both ecologically, but also socially. And so this is I'm gonna have a lag here between my computer and the screen, but this kind of got my interest in restoration, and these kinds of sites this is that same site. This is a site of restoration about a year in, and it's really amazing, a lot of beautiful plants and habitat that have showed up there. But when I look at this, I also see a really complex kind of social conversation entering in with those habitats. The where and how the fencing looks, this little road through there, that access road, where each plant was planted, who's in the conversation for what plant where. All those things were just like really, often very just complicated, but also really contentious at times between the off-highway vehicle users who didn't want the planting to take the place of their favorite slip face that they like to ride on. And so I just kind of got really interested in what restoration is and wanted to know more. Came up here where there's the environmental studies program, an amazing professor, Dan Spencer, who is working for a long time about ethics of ecological restoration, how we think about the natural world, kind of those academic questions, but the ones that I also feel are really important, for land managers, practitioners, and everybody. So I'm curious how many of you have heard of ecological restoration? I imagine many of you in the room. Yeah, it's pretty common now. Maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago, not so much. It's on almost everyone's list of things that they do for management, conservation, even just businesses have kind of restoration on their minds. Just briefly, in 1990, the Society for Ecological Restoration established their first definition, which was the process of intentionally altering a site to establish a defined indigenous historic ecosystem. The goal of the process is to emulate the structure, function, diversity of that ecosystem. So that's sort of that traditional, put it back to how it was before the damage happened, the injury, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of the way that most people would think of it in their head, and I certainly did before. And that's also what happened at the dunes. There were plants there. They got run over or killed, and now we're putting them back there. It's pretty simple, straightforward, make a mess, clean it up. But then you start to think of how you do this, and the Society for Ecological Restoration, 30 years later, has released these 8 principles, which I'm not going to get into, but they put as number 1, engage stakeholders, draw on many types of knowledge, informed by those reference ecosystems, not necessarily dictated by them. As we're seeing climate change, as we're seeing different changes in ecosystems, invasive species, you can't always rely on putting it back to how it was 50 years ago. All these really complicated questions, and they're trying to grapple with that. And another component that they really added is that you have to focus on the local, the regional people. And it's not a simple thing to add people into the equation, but what people were realizing, for one thing, is you do a restoration project, 10 years later, everything's dead, nobody watered it, nobody managed it. That's not really the goal, right? So if you don't include people on the front end, help them understand what's going on, maybe get them involved, you might not have as durable projects. So that's sort of like this, growth of the field, and that's kind of where my work at the university jumped in. And I'm not going to get into this as much, but there's a lot of local examples. This is Missoula is kind of an amazing hub of ecological restoration. There's beaver dam analogs, Superfund cleanups, all kinds of things happening in this region. It's being used, as I said, all around the world, and so it's worthy of study. And how could we do it well? How could we do good restoration in Missoula is kind of the question I had. So I'm going to get right into the site of Grant Creek, and I know many of you are coming from interstate up, and I am going to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to bring your attention downstream as well and talk more about what's going on below the interstate, which if you're like me, my first couple months here, I knew about Snowbowl, I knew about Grant Creek Road. I didn't know much about Grant Creek below the interstate, so I'm going to walk through some of that. So this is a photo of Grant Creek that I took on the ridge between Butler Creek and Grant Creek. There's no trails here, no roads. There wasn't much historical mining. It was kind of just inaccessible. It's pretty amazingly pristine in a lot of ways, kind of currently and historically untouched by the other influences that we see all over the region. It's inaccessible. It's hard to even get to. This is bushwhacking a little ways up from that trail that goes around the back of Snowbowl. But it's in the Rattlesnake Wilderness. It's just an absolutely beautiful area. This is the headwaters. But it does flow down to the Clark Fork, and it's hard to see here, but it flows down to the Clark Fork. People have been calling it sort of the forgotten wilderness stream because unlike Rattlesnake, which is well-loved, well-known, it kind of doesn't have as much attention, and there's a variety of reasons for that, but it's really, in a similar situation to Rattlesnake in a lot of ways. Of course, I think we have to acknowledge that this is the Aboriginal territories of the Salish Kalispel people. From time immemorial, many more tribes traveled through this area. There's, history of their use of the ridge tops, traveled between the Mission Mountains. There's history of the Road to the Buffalo, which is right by the interstate here, campsites in this area. Really amazing, kind of just a deep, rich history of this creek with the Salish. And I have this name here, which I try to pronounce every time, try to get better. It's Nishkesulum, which translates to Little Wide Creek You Can Cross, and that's how it's known to the Salish. And I'll get into a little bit of the geomorphology that connects to. But the situation for how I got involved in this, I just first became aware of what was called the Mullen Area Master Plan. Now it's called the Swatipcane Master Plan. It's the area, this polygon that it was written up as a way to kind of get ahead of the just subdivisions everywhere version of growth in Missoula and try to make a better plan for the next thousands of people who are moving here, and try to bring a better holistic view to a neighborhood, density, farms, parks, amenities, that kind of thing. And I in that conversation, I heard from people like Bert, like Vicki Watson, who've just been talking about Grant Creek forever, saying, hey, let's restore Grant Creek while we're at it. It flows through this area here, and you're not going to be able to see it too well. But in that place, it's really beat up. So it's not in great shape. And so when I hear restoration, I think, oh, what's the degradation? What's the issue? And that's how I kind of dove in. And I saw that the process was underway, but there might be a need for a refreshed framing, more awareness in the community, and a deeper analysis, at least what I could contribute from my position as a master's student. So I started talking to people, started to getting to know people in the place, started wandering around Grant Creek, and getting interested. And lo and behold, it was an interesting stream to study. Through the end of my first year, I got involved with the Clark Fork Coalition, getting kind of their first step into the process off the ground, which was a riparian assessment. So that was our first, get the sense of the stream. What's the situation right now? They wanted to know what the health of the stream was from top to bottom, but really we ended up walking from Snowbowl Road down to the confluence with a few minor exceptions of land we didn't get permission to walk through. So in the summer 2021, I maybe passed by some of your houses. I spent all summer, in the stream, collecting a variety of different ecological criteria, simple bank stability, vegetation health, fish habitat, kind of the basic riparian indicators, and develop this little study for the outcome being a map showing where areas were sustainable, at risk, or totally unsustainable, where there was just maybe flooding concerns or the bank was about to fail. And as you can see, probably not see, green up here all the way through this area. When it hits the interstate, it starts getting yellow, which was that at-risk category, and then pretty much down to the bottom, it's almost completely red, which is unsustainable. And so, that's the broad strokes of what we found. It's not, it's not too, you could walk out there and see it and say, this is unsustainable, right? But it really helped to have this holistic view of the stream from top to bottom. And then along with that, where there's those relationships that we really started building in the watershed. So above I-90, we have that, clearly a wide riparian corridor. You can see that from the road. You can see that in the HOAs. There's a lot of stewardship and care on the edges of people's properties and through the ranches. There's the Forest Service, the ranch, the HOAs, kind of bigger landowners a lot of times, or at least local neighborhood councils like this one that talk to each other and develop sort of more holistic management of the stream, or at least awareness. So up above I-90, you put the pieces together and you say it's looking pretty good. It'd be easy to say that's good enough, but as we all know, the water keeps flowing and it goes down to the Clark Fork and it keeps flowing from there. So these things are interconnected, and this process was all about sort of elevating our understanding to be able to speak to those interconnections in a better way. So we broke it up. I'm not going to get too in detail on why the segments or what we're going for there, but essentially just to break up the stream, you see the interstate there. I'll walk over here. You can see Grant Creek kind of flows away from the road and comes down here, and you may see it at Highlander Beer down here. They have that patio that opens up to the creek. But below here, it kind of bends and goes along the railroad tracks. It's thought that historically it would have shot straight through. And that was that kind of coming out of a narrow valley. It widens out into the Missoula Valley. And that's sort of that wide creek element from the Salish name that matches some of that expected geomorphology. But it was at one point, before the earliest aerial imagery, before the 1950s, ditched and moved along the railroad tracks. And here, it goes along the railroad tracks and then cuts under Broadway pretty inconspicuously, but you may see that culvert as you're driving into town. And it makes this big old, what's been called Horseshoe Bend, which is a pretty traditional, use of the stream to push it off to the edge of the workable land and ditch it, use it for irrigation. That's what happened here. And it's pretty much completely straightened as it flows down here. And then this is Hiawatha Road, and we're getting down to Mullen in a minute. But this is where some of that really severe degradation happens. It's known in that area mostly as a ditch. And that was one of the most amazing parts of this whole experience, is people saying, Grant Creek, what do you mean? Grant Ditch, or just the ditch that I've always used. And so that's kind of another, for me, it's where I see those social components becoming a big part, because, there's legal designations of what a ditch is, but there's also just social understandings and how we treat things. If we call it a ditch, we use it as a ditch, that kind of thing. Really important to what ended up happening on Grant Creek. So down here, this is zoomed in again, but it flows down under Hiawatha Road, which is a private road, the old rail spur. But then it comes down and makes this really amazingly unnatural 90-degree bend. It comes down here and flows under Mullen Road in a fairly small culvert right by the Hellgate store, and kind of as you're making your way up the hill, You may notice it by the Mullen Trail HOA is another marker. And just to zoom on ahead, I'll talk a little bit more about the findings, but this is the last bit of Grant Creek as it flows down below Mullen Road, probably ditched here too, flows down, and it has a little bit more floodplain area in this ranch land, but it was also used pretty heavily. And it flows down all the way to Kelly Island. And some of you likely have used the southern Kelly Island fishing access, and some of you may have used even northern fishing access. That's really right where Grant Creek flows out. So if that, hopefully that connects the dots a little bit on where Grant Creek goes through town. It doesn't really match the flow of the streets and everything, but it makes it. And geologically, it's considered to be intermittent. Today it is, and historically likely. It doesn't quite have as big of a watershed coming down as the Rattlesnake does. So some of that water, when it comes down at a certain point in the summer, it usually just filters into the ground in the big glacial cobble that we have in the valley. So it's likely historically it was intermittent, but it goes dry way sooner and kind of has all these other factors that have led it to be more degraded now than even historically. And fish do pass up Grant Creek, even on those high flows. That's when a lot of the cutthroat trout migrate. And then also one thing that's been really amazing to hear is that Grant Creek has it hosts some of the most genetically pure bull trout in this region, in the headwaters. And they don't migrate, they're resident species they're resident population up there. But it's really amazing to know that in this really beat up stream, there's still these amazing populations of bull trout. So I'm kind of zipping through, but I want to make time for some activities and some discussion. So I'll just go through some of my findings. This is a photo of, you can't even see the top of the bank, but this is like 10 feet inset, long-term ditch down by the airport. This is an old tractor crossing. Very functional. This is another little ditched area closer to the Mullen Trail HOA where the roots are really the only bottom. I mean, that's not a sign of a healthy stream. There's no floodplain, no gravel bars, and no pools. Obviously, it's dry and dewatered at this time of year. Some other findings. I have a bunch of them here, but some of the more interesting ones in that little photo there, I'm standing on a dam that was constructed to better use the water. And as a result, actually that water there, when we walked down that part of the stream, it was dry, and then we started hitting water, and we were saying, how is this possible? It was dry up here. How is there water? We found out that's Clark Fork water being funneled over by Imagination Brewery. The ditch that used to go through past Staples, on Mullen Road, would get fanned out across that working land, and they would use Grant Creek Channel as a backwater and push water up the channel to be used by their pumps, which is just kind of fantastically wrong in some ways, you might think. That was the last year that they actually used the Flynn Mounty ditch, and it's been shut down to leave some of that water in the Clark Fork, and they've drilled wells for the folks who are using the land now. So that's changed, but the dam is also a fish passage barrier, and it's also been removed since we walked this area. Another amazing thing is that it's actually perennial in that lower section. So it goes dry in the middle, and then it's spring fed in the lowest section. So there's kind of continuous fish rearing habitat down below, but there's that dry section in between, which is just kind of unique. There's obviously various land uses. I mean, for me, this has just been an amazing way to get to know kind of all the various land uses that there are in town. There's, ranching, public land, industrial, commercial, suburban residential, high density, low density residential, and fishing access down below. But again, it's significantly degraded. There's a history of flooding in Missoula with Grant Creek. The Mullen Trail subdivision faced a really kind of nasty flood in 1997 And there was a lot of legal contention throughout that process. So that's how a lot of people know it. There is that fish habitat connectivity. Again, as I mentioned, long history of Salish trails from both the Bitterroot, across the road to the Buffalo, and all throughout this area, as we all know. The campsite of Meriwether Lewis camped at the confluence in 1806 and complained about mosquitoes. That's about all he wrote in his journal before he probably went back into wherever he was sleeping. I think I have a photo here of some of the oldest structures in the valley, continuous structures in the valley. This is right near where the Hellgate Trading Post would have been. And I have this little bit of trivia where there's a house down there where 3 siblings were born into 3 different states, Washington Territory, Idaho Territory, and Montana Territory, as those boundaries shifted in the same physical structure, which is kind of funny. And then back to the social relationships, there's long-standing relationships. People have lived there their whole lives, their families have. And there's people who have moved there in the last 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. Not that, there's this whole range of different people who have different relationships with each other and with the creek. How am I doing on time, Bert?
You're doing great, but you're moving fast, which is important.
Yeah, moving fast. But you got the trivia. You got to have the trivia that you'll tell your friends, about Grant Creek. These are some interviews and some quotes from interviews that I liked. I won't dwell on this too much either. But there's a lot of subtlety to the way people think about a stream and their relationship with it. People talked about their own agency, what their kind of management agency, but they also talked about the stream's agency in their lives. They say let Mother Nature take care of it, clean it out if that's necessary, do a little bit for it, but also let the stream do its work. Talking about beavers being agents of change. Beavers had a different plan, as they often do. People saying that irrigation was actually reliant on the flooding from Grant Creek, made the ground usable. There's this ethic of reciprocity that people had that I pulled out from the interviews. People just asserting you take care of the land, it'll take care of you. People saying, I do believe that we should give back instead of just taking. This other person just putting it in human terms, a smile begets a smile simply, but referring to the creek, saying, I put love into the creek and the creek returns it in these different ways. So kind of those, a little more subtle ways that people are expressing their understanding of Grant Creek, as I'm sure you all have as well. So I'm going to pause here and just ask this bigger question of you and get a drink of water. I want to ask you to turn to the person next to you, maybe someone new if you can, and talk for a little bit about this bigger question. What is Missoula's story? I know it's a big, broad question on purpose, but for this activity, 5 to 10 minutes, just to talk for a little bit about your familiarity with Grant Creek prior to today. I usually, this is going to be different for you all, but maybe you can talk about, did you know about the lower area at all? And then discuss what stories or threads should be a part of what we call Missoula's story. And be ready to share a little bit out any sort of trivia or any bigger ideas that you have about what's part of Missoula's story. And again, don't need anyone to sum it all up, but it'd be nice to just hear what you think is important to the story of Missoula as it stands in 2023, the Grant Creek Neighborhood Council meeting. So I'll pause there and just let you chat for a moment. And folks on Zoom, you can please write stuff in the chat. I don't think we'll have you unmute the chat with each other, but please do include stuff in the chat.
Seamus, I'm scared people might not talk. Just some ideas that I heard during an earlier version of this was that there was a Buddha house at the mouth
Yeah.
of Grand Creek.
Oh, you are.
Now,
I can share that, or I can share that.
I remember, I heard that when I heard that story, that was because I thought she was,
No, no. Yeah.
this fucking part of the series too, and there's one that had some stories of like right at like the intersection of the interstate and like what you do in this neighborhood is like. I think he'll tell you, yeah, I think we'll get more context with it.
You walk by my house, right?
Introduced you to
How's it
the
going?
other day, because I
All
was
right.
sitting outside of the downtown association.
The end of the same way, right?
We're having
Yeah.
a conversation about river stuff with them, so you were running into this.
That's my good memory.
I used to work,
I went to the wrong hotel. Why I got there late. I've never been in there, so I was sort of glad to see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's
He's
just a
really good,
hotel.
yeah.
Or a motel.
That was. Yeah, totally. That is funny.
And at the plant, I knew about Red.
Cookies are pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Every once in a while, you gotta.
Uh-huh. So you're pretty like up to speed on the.
Oh, yeah.
At least
It's,
aware,
Kind
yeah.
of labor on love.
Yeah, I think that, like.
I'm in charge of, yard work.
Thing was really like the person.
My wife does some
On my
work.
radar, even working.
She's in charge of more of the inside.
Fairly familiar
She has higher standards than I do.
And like I
So that
just
works
been
out.
out, but never.
And,
the island and
we
never
really like
really
the
connected
area.
with it. I've been up and down Snow Hole.
And,
We had one of the students, because I work on the outreach side of the organization.
yeah. Yeah.
Working with people, not so much with like the street. And I had a
Oh,
student who
yeah.
started to try and collect the data off the stream. And we
My
started
wife put that up. I don't know.
and look on maps, see the maps that we go there.
Yeah, I remember. I was like, I knew that. I was gonna show me something, say, yeah.
But in the last year, I didn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I saw in the thing, and I was like, oh, you'll be right back.
And the pond
Oh,
road
nice.
don't
Yeah.
necessarily
That is super. Yeah.
You got a lot of things, right? Pine needles coming out of the.
Definitely, yeah. No, it'll
The
be.
whole,
Hoping to wrap up more. just
been
what's
out of
happening
town for
now.
like 3 days, so I should walk.
Good, perfect.
Cool.
All right, good to see you.
Yeah, I don't either, really not, it's already, been through that phase. I'm not. But, yeah. So did you used to live in the city and then you moved out?
Where and how. Like when is the right time, like is this shaking?
Okay, so you're kind of,
All right.
rural area. Okay.
We'll wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice flat. My previous house had a totally flat lot. And, yeah, it's definitely just making. Yeah, you don't need, no decks or wire.
All right, I'm glad you all are talking. Nice. Yeah. So we're gonna, I wanted to back up for just a step. You're fine. Back up for just a step and remind us sort of why am I asking this question? I mean, I think it's a nice question to ask once in a while, but what is the importance of asking what is Missoula's story? I brought up that idea of restoring, restoration, and the way we kind of worked through this conversation. Restoration clearly needs a social component to it. So we ask ourselves, what is the story that we're both enacting and recognizing in the landscape, the history of the place and the people who live there. So I think it is important to ask, what is Missoula's story? And I'm curious to hear what you all came up with, whether it's just little trivia about what what I heard. One funny thing I always hear is that Bert is the terror of little kids playing with their rocks in Grant Creek. So that's always something that's a funny thing to hear. But yeah, anything that came up for you all? Things that you knew about Grant Creek, or the story?
I think you mentioned earlier how Grant Creek is kind of the lesser of the creeks. You got Rattlesnake. And I think one of the reasons is because there's no access to Grant Creek, especially as you go up into the upper parts of it. And there used to be access. There was a trailhead.
Yeah.
And then it was essentially abandoned, I guess, and given back, and they put in the Ravine Trail. So, which basically takes you up into the Rattlesnake. So
Right.
Grant Creek is, I've hiked that trail, I've hunted that trail back when you could still get up it.
Yeah.
It took you pretty much up to Mosquito Peak, or, you kind of get up to that divide that drops you down into the upper part of the cherry stem of the Rattlesnake. So it's pretty cool up in there. It's neat. And in some ways, it's too bad that disappeared, because it took away that access to some really cool wilderness area.
The awareness, Scott's talking about the access to Grant Creek, which we did, that kind of reminded ourselves just the other day. That's actually, that Kelly Island is the only public access to Grant Creek on the whole stream. There is public land and there is HOA land, but that's actually the only public access down at the confluence. And when people go down there, they maybe don't even know that Grant Creek's there. That's a great point. Any other, anyone willing to tackle that bigger question of what is Missoula's story? Some people will talk about growth. Some people talk about, someone on the Zoom, on the chat mentioned, how do we assure the preservation and restoration of Grant Creek in the context of fewer or more dramatic flows due to climate change, due to the flooding or droughts. So that's sort of maybe part of the story too, that's in the context.
I could talk a little bit about just the history of Grant Creek. We've had people come in the past and talk to us years ago. And, there really is kind of an interesting history of that. For example, Johnny Grant, what does he have to do with that? Do you know Mary Frances Flynn, by any chance?
I don't myself know, but I've heard many times that
Okay.
she's got a bunch of history.
She's one of the Flynns.
Right.
Around that Flynn ditch and all, and then I think they've got water rights on the creek.
Right. Yeah, and I think she lives down below where Grant Creek used to flow straight, and where it now is pushed to the
It
side.
got pushed in the ditch mostly,
Yeah.
doesn't it? That's where
Right.
it ends up.
Yeah.
mostly.
Exactly. Yeah, some of the other bits of trivia on Grant Creek, the Rankin family, of course, is a long storied history in Missoula. Richard Grant was a fur trapper. It was originally called Knowlton Creek, actually. Two brothers came over from, I think, Ohio. They settled here for a little while, couldn't make it. They left. Richard Grant settled here and kind of established, the name, and was more permanent living here. So that's sort of maybe some of that settler history is an important part of the story of Missoula. Just recognizing that history is relevant. Any other bits of Grant Creek? Did anyone grow up on Grant Creek? Yes.
I was gonna say, way back when the Native Americans were coming over from our Lee area and the Jocko, that was a big connector
Grant Creek Trail. And that's part of the reason the Forest Service wanted to close it off, is because the Salish didn't want so many white guys coming out to their reservation. But as far as being a native trail, thousands of years.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's important to note too, that the upper part of the watershed butts up against the tribal wilderness, which is another kind of, it's the US, the Western government approach to wilderness and the tribal wilderness, and that's a really interesting aspect as well. And then, yeah, of course, the kind of archaeological feature, you know, you don't always want to have access where there's important archaeological, history and maybe artifacts. Yeah.
So you said there was no mining up there, but there was a lot of logging.
There was very little mining. I think there were a couple little mining claims up there, maybe for silver. Yeah, and very, but minor compared to other places. And then the timber has been not as prevalent up above, but yes, down here in sort of this lower area, kind of Snowball Road and down, it was very significant. I don't have some photos that show that, you know, the trees were kind of cut down all the way to the creek and then down the ones on the creek. And, you know, it's grown back a little bit, but a lot of that was post initial extraction, yeah.
I was told by a forester that there were cedars, the property, and there's some huge trees that have been cut. And that's what you said, we thought they were cedars. And then
Wow.
we've got a barrel stave that we found on their property around Snowball.
Okay. Wow, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. I know people mention that it's so narrow that it kind of has a wetter, you know, botanical class of plants up further up. It's narrow canyon, kind of less sun, and so the moisture stays in that valley. So I have heard little things, little snippets of about the big cedars up there. I haven't seen it myself, but that's interesting. Yeah.
I have a good one.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about it a little bit. Answer that I heard from my partner and turning it into a story in Missoula. So when they moved into the area as a land use planner and really diving into what the development and the land use and the potential is in the area, and then the other partner being a hydrogeologist and looking at really at the creek and the flooding and the water supply. And I think that's a great Missoula story, that like both of those views are in the same house and are so related in where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it can't be understated. A lot of people I met on Grant Creek have been here for maybe 30, 40 years, but a lot of people are new to Montana. And I think, you know, that's worth noting, especially for me coming in. I've been here 2-3 years. I just think it's a different relationship when you don't grow up on the place. You know, that's how I feel about it. But I think that's just an interesting thing to reflect on as we figure out what it means to love a place and how we go about living there. So thank you all for that. Bert had I'd mentioned this before, and I'm glad he reminded me. At the last time I gave this presentation, somebody who doesn't currently live on Grant Creek mentioned she did grow up in Missoula, and she mentioned kind of an amazing little bit of local history. And Bert, help me if I missed something, but she essentially said that there was a playhouse up here, or rather
the Buddha.
The Buddha house.
We refer to it as the Buddha house.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it had Oriental architecture. It was somewhere where the quarry is now, I'm told. And I learned all sorts of things from her comments because she had been active in high school in the drama world. And apparently, when you are finished with your production, you bury the play. Well, I never heard of such a thing. Who ever heard? I mean, you talk about social. Wow, I never. You bury the play. See, I read a lot of plays. I never buried them. Well, anyway, they would always bury the play at the Buddha house. Who knows? I don't know what the basis of that Oriental architecture was, where it went, but she remembers it from the 50s and her high school period.
Yeah, pretty amazing, and just, you know, can only imagine what how different this would have looked through here even then. So just to keep moving on, I just threw a couple slides up here of parts of Missoula's history that I've learned since being here. It's going to delay for a little while, but there's obviously the you know, the history of many tribes occupying this land. That's the kind of the famous photo out near the Clark Fork. But there's the, you know, intense extraction of timber and mining and more. And, you know, then there's also this story of restoration just upstream of us, the Milltown Dam coming out, Rattlesnake Dam coming out, kind of this new maybe amenities economy coming in as opposed to industrial, and the change in the way Missoulians look at the place, you know, and then just all kinds of other things as well. This messes up my comedic timing here, but just having you know, there's lots of dogs in the town. There's all these different ways to tell Missoula's story. All I'm doing is sort of kind of expanding that idea of what's the history, in order to show you how challenging it is to think about Grant Creek's story, you know, in particular, and then its relevance to restoration. If you're going to go talk about what do we do about it, it's just, there's so many different threads, so many complex parts of the story. So how do we go about doing that? Restoring offers us the idea of narrative continuity, connecting to the past, connecting the future to the past through the present. You know, the idea of embodied storytelling, where you have to recognize that you're telling a story when you're doing it. I don't know why this is delaying. There's potential to make stories compelling. You know, how do we tell a good story? How do we do a good restoration with a good story? Dramatic dam removal is always a good one. And then maybe inclusive, thinking about who's involved in the story, who's involved in telling it, who's involved as characters in the story. And then, you know, updating the story as you go along. This thing seems to have frozen. But I'll read a quote that I really like, that I from somebody I talked to a couple times. They say, "Now Grant Creek's role has changed. I think we need to embrace that and change Grant Creek to a new entity. It's like stuck halfway in the past and half in the future, not in either place. Give it a life, a real life." So this person's referring to the ditching of the stream and saying that that's the past usage, and people kind of know it as a creek, they kind of know it as a ditch. It's stuck halfway in the past, half in the future, and so there's the need to kind of break through that. This is fully, yeah, there it is. Well, and this is the wrap up, just thinking about how do we tell the story. And I'm just gonna cue you in. I know I don't want to take too long here, but talking about what's going on right now. The Clark Fork Coalition has sponsored this emergence of this group. A lot of folks in the room have contributed to it. The Grant Creek Working Group, which has been meeting for about a year now, kind of have this slide here. What is collaboration? It's working towards shared goals. It's kind of a buzzword nowadays, but it's really important as a way to talk about multiple disciplines, multiple boundaries, private properties, public properties. How do you think about a watershed across all these complex boundaries and different interests? It embraces diverse skill sets, you know, land use planner and a hydrogeologist. You gotta kind of find the connections. You use interest-based negotiations. You don't say, I want this, I want this. You kind of work out your interest. What am I interested in? And maybe you find a little bit more connection or ability to talk. It's process-oriented, open-ended, emergent. You get those durable outcomes potentially where people are committed to the project, committed to the outcome. And really, you know, a restoration happens and then people steward that land, as many of you do in this part of the creek. Grant Creek Working Group's mission is to ensure that the restoration and protection of Grant Creek is a central goal. There's been a consensus process throughout the year. There's been a lot of group learning, field trips. There's been field trips every Friday of this week, seeing it after a long winter of talking about it. It's been so fun to see what we're talking about and come up with these different ideas. Developing a vision and strategy, and that's the goal of this group. Coming up with a sense of how are we going to manage, restore, preserve, conserve Grant Creek from headwaters down to the confluence at the Clark Fork. And that's really the goal, thinking about the water body in that connected way. one of the outcomes here is this little, some recommendations for the part of the creek that's going to be restored, renaturalized near the airport. And this is ongoing. Curious to hear that comment maybe later after I finish this. It's near the end. So this is that area that I was referring to, and actually that commenter said the flatlands, which is, I think is funny. I like that way of referring to this part. But this is down below Broadway again, and the renaturalization goal right now, the conversation's about connecting this part and making it more meanders and less like a ditch. I have a photo.
Does that cross right there?
That goes from some private land to airport land as well.
So it's a mixed number of owners? It's
Yes.
not like just two? It's
Not,
multiple?
no, it's multiple, yeah. This is a photo from Highlander where we meet last Friday of every month. It's been a really great place to share ideas and meet people who are working on these issues in the community. And there's talk of restoration projects, back to restoration. How are we gonna do this? What are we gonna do? This is a landowner down in the bottom whose land is used for agriculture historically, but he's really interested in renaturalizing, restoring his property. And there's a lot of promise to do some really ambitious and really exciting projects down at the bottom. Here's an example of just a draft concept project for this is early stage drafting, but just kind of what a restored, renaturalized channel would look like. And I will end with kind of a nod to you all for your ongoing stewardship of not only Grant Creek, but of the conversation, because the community engagement is clearly such a huge part of restoring any conception of what restoration would mean. So I have this big list of things: educational outreach, community definition and understanding of restoration, a commitment to a story, interpretive signage, citizen science, arts and music, public process, stewardship, community conversations, recreation, and then all the acronyms in Missoula that do such amazing work, including Friends of Grant Creek. Bert mentioned the Watershed Education Network, CFC, Clark Fork Coalition, Grant Creek Trails Association. And I just want to highlight too Bert's long-term relationship with the CSKT and the Culture Committee in getting these beautiful signs up that tell a lot of the history of Grant Creek, which you may have seen on the trail, and then these benches, which again, I just want to kind of land here and highlight that this is restoring and this is kind of engagement with the creek that can make a really big difference for the community and for the stream itself. So I just want to kind of highlight those bright spots, that those things are happening, and it's thanks to you all. So with that, I'll just close, and I'm happy to take any questions or let you all get out of here, but thanks. Happy to take any questions. I don't know if there was anything in the chat either, but you may be ready for your captain to sign us off.
There's a hand up.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay.
Let's go in the room here first, and I'll get to you next, Tony. That's okay?
I'll try to stop. I can't speak
Oh,
very loudly.
no worries.
Is there no way to straighten it underneath the railroad tracks there before it makes that hard dino?
So that's sort of that idea of restoring it to its previous condition, right? That makes a lot of intuitive sense. I think you just faced there the pragmatic realities of complex land use. There's Hellgate Elementary School's right there, all these different houses that are in the path where it used to go. I mean, I think I personally really value recognizing those pragmatic realities and not just ruling it out, saying like, this is what restoration to a previous condition would look like. And then you say why we're not doing it, but then what we still will do, as opposed to just saying like, that'll never happen. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty much just seems like a practical impossibility, as they say. And I don't feel good saying those words, but that's what I've been told, and it seems pretty true with just the property ownership down through that area. Yeah, Tony, feel free to unmute yourself and.
Hi there. I think probably most of what you were just about to, what you just said answers my question, which is I'm a person who likes concrete steps, who says, hey, let's get involved and let's start doing X, Y, and Z to get to where the goal we need to go. And it sounds like I'm also somebody who's realistic, who thinks that, you know, obviously there are some property owners who aren't going to play ball, but anything you can do to start and develop that plan for, as I said, the flatlands, because, you know, I think Bert and a lot of the other people in the Grant Creek area have done a great job at keeping Grant Creek pretty good through, you know, to the 90. But after that, it gets a little bit, I love the fact that I learned that it was a ditch from, you know, to the Clark Fork. So yeah, I guess the moral of the story is not to waste anybody else's time, but what are the concrete steps that we can start taking as a community to start making sure that our representatives and our homeowners south of the 90 and property owners south of the 90 start to think about how can we do this to, it's never going to be what it was before development came to this town, but what can we do to get it back to a point where it looks a little bit more? And isn't that going to increase people's property values? And isn't that going to be nicer to be against than just a ditch? So.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize that, thanks. You know, what can we do? What are the concrete steps that we can do to improve it below? I think, you know, in this room, I think recognizing what you do have and how you've gotten it and how you've kept it, and then sort of showing that as an example, not saying like get your room in order down there in the lowlands necessarily, but saying this is what it can be, you know, welcoming people, you know, when they come up here and say, oh, this is Grant Creek, where does it flow from here? You know, those things really help set the standard for what a stream can be and how it can be taken care of. And someone in the chat mentions, you know, using less fertilizer, recognizing that there are people who live on the stream downstream. I mean, those are kind of those connections that it's not just about it's in bad shape there, fix it. It's about really, let's think about this as a community that lives on Grant Creek. And I think that's something that you can kind of take on even though it looks great up here. I think just recognizing it flows into the Clark Fork, and again, as I mentioned, downstream of the Pacific Ocean, where I grew up. So this is all sort of connected, but how do we make that and kind of establish that? And that's getting a little away from those concrete steps that you mentioned, Tony. But there are a lot that are coming out of this vision and strategy process, and I would welcome, and I know Lily would too, anybody to show up to these Grant Creek Working Group meetings. Lily can put you on the list right here now. And we'd love to have you. There's a couple more field trips this week or this month. One more this Friday going to Mullen Trail area, and then one more the following Friday going to the area just below the interstate.
The one he was just talking about.
Right. Yeah.
So the one that's closest to us.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways that we'd love to get you involved and, you know, get your perspectives in the room, or, you know, let you learn from others. It's been a really cool experience being part of that group.
And again, Seamus, one of the things the upper residents of Grant Creek can do is, as much as possible, provide clear, cool, clean water downstream. You know, that stuff all has to come from above and get through us intact to be of any use further down. And so there's only a few landowners up here, and, you know, to the degree that we keep our riparian quarters intact, to the degree that we don't over fertilize our lawns or over herbicide our lawns, etc., we can help keep Grant Creek a cold, clear, productive cold water fishery.
Yeah.
Which it won't stay clear and cold if we don't pay attention.
Right, and we've heard that from the fish biologists, that there is a sense of urgency that this kind of fish passage is so important as temperatures increase, and this stream is an important tributary. Thanks, nice, some solidarity. Scott, you have?
Yeah, Scott Nicholson, Prospect. This dovetails a little bit into what Bert was saying. You know, we're talking about how good Grant Creek is down here on this kind of lower end that's just above the interstate. But if you look at it in August, it's hardly flowing. Like, if you look at the Prospect Bridge that goes into Prospect Meadows, it's not dry last summer, but it was, for all practical purposes, nearly dry. And I would, if I was you guys, I would look at the water that's being taken out of Grant Creek. Some of it's on our property. It's not being taken out by us, but it's being taken out by irrigators. And from my understanding, a lot of those irrigation purposes and what that water was historically used for are housing developments now. You know, they're not even, like, those historical water rights aren't even in existence anymore. The people are still taking water out, but it's not being used for irrigation. So I don't know how good of lawyers you have, or, you know.
None,
But there's those battles that can be fought down the road to try and get some of that water to stay in the creek and help it get to the Clark Fork at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important part of it. I mean, withdrawals are a big part of the lack of water, you know, late in the season. And again, it was intermittent likely, but where and when it goes dry and how warm that water is when it gets, even if it gets dumped back into the creek, makes a big difference. And there's a big component of the conversation that'll be about the water rights and some really tangible, potentially buying water rights, or just, you know, convincing people to use it for retaining in-stream flow. That's a huge part of it. And so, yeah, and some of the oldest water rights in this region are in Grant Creek watershed here. So it's kind of an amazing, another part of the amazing history. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, I think I've talked enough, at least I think I did. But I really appreciate your attention.
Okay, well, the good news, you need something.
I was gonna just close the screen, but that's fine.
Well, we'll just leave the thank you up there. It's always appropriate. The good news is this has been recorded, so there's been a lot of pain in making the technology work tonight, but it does mean that Seamus's talk is recorded, our thoughts are recorded, and that could be of value down the line. So I want to give Mike Cole a chance to speak. Mike, would you tell us a little bit about the role? Why don't you come up here and tell us a little bit about the role of the Wildfire Risk Task Force of the Friends of Grant Creek and what you guys have been able to do, okay?
Thank you, Bert. So my name is Mike Cole, and I'm the project leader for the Grant Creek Wildfire Risk Task Force. And as we've mentioned in other meetings in the last couple of years, we're putting together a community wildfire protection program specifically for Grant Creek. And I would need to give you an update on that. We've actually produced our draft. It's probably about 90% done. And we met today with the Office of Emergency Management, and they took a look at it and had a few comments. But we're to the point now where our board of directors for Friends of Grant Creek, that's who we operated under their direction. And they're in the process of reviewing it. Once they sign off on it, then we have 3 people in the community that we call a peer review to look at the validity of the document and the science in the document. And one of those is a retired forestry professor from University of Montana. One is a retired district ranger from Sealy Lake. Another one is a retired forester from Bitterroot. And that also works with Bitterroot RC&D, where a lot of grant money comes from. So once that's done, then what we'll do is we'll ship it to the Office of Emergency Management, and they will get feedback from all the police and fire agencies, all the way from local to federal in the Missoula area that, you know, has been involved in putting this thing together as far as providing information and, you know, different meetings that have gone on with the agencies and with city council members, things like that. And once we get back that feedback, then there will be a process to get it to the public. Now, when we talked to the Max Rebels today from the Office of Emergency Services, he said he thinks because it's site specific to Grant Creek, that there'll probably just be Grant Creek residents that'll want to review that rather than putting it out to the general public. Although there will be certain areas, you know, we've done a lot of coverage is interesting. We're going from water to fire. So we actually have cited your 2021 report in the section of watershed. So we're looking at everything. We've gone, just to kind of a repeat of what you've done. We've looked at the historic aspect of it, from the Salish to the Rankins. We've looked at the natural environment. We've looked at the built environment. And then we've looked at fire weather and the different types of vegetation and their burning rates and things like that. So there's a lot of science in there that needs to be looked at too, but we're on the right track. So we're heading that direction so we can get this thing finalized. So, and is there any questions?
Yeah, Sally Tibbs, do you know anything about DNRC clearing property?
DNRC, well, I know if you contact the Office of Emergency Management, they're the best source to get you in touch with folks
Well, so my
to work in
question
your
is,
property.
I've had my property cleared, but they told me that they'll just do it once.
That is the case.
Yeah.
That is the case, okay.
But it's good you've
It
already done
grows
it.
back, I mean, you know.
Well, that's what you're gonna see with this document. It all grows back.
Yeah,
So,
and about 4 years.
yeah. So it's, you know, taking care of your property, it's not a one-time thing. It's a yearly thing. And the more you do it yearly, the less you have to do, unless you wait 5 or 10 years, and then the cost gets a lot more expensive. So what you want to do is take care of things you can do yourself, especially. John's a member of the task force
Hi,
also.
John Langstaff. I'd just like to add to Mike's explanation of the fire protection plan. When we get this certified, we're going to be able to access over $8 million in federal grants throughout the United States. But that's only going to certified communities that have a fire protection plan in place. So
Yeah, and there are other funding sources
we
too.
got some big wheels turning.
Yeah, when you actually have a plan, you apply for grants. It's a lot easier to get than just saying we need money to do something. That's the difference between them. So.
And Missoula Rural Fire District is also doing clearing. And that's someone that probably will respond quicker than DNRC.
Yeah, there are grants out there all the time and new ones coming. So just figure, if you live in Grant Creek, you have a different kind of responsibility than somebody that lives in the middle of Missoula. Because you have a lot of responsibility to your neighbors.
I might have missed this, but did you say where this plan was hosted, like where people could find it when it's in its finished form?
We're still working on that. It'll still be in draft form when we get comments from the neighborhoods. But as far as how you would see it, easiest way is to put it on a website. But when it's actually completely done, it'll be a part of the Missoula County's Community Wildfire Protection Plan. This will just be a specific location in the county that has their own separate plan, but it's all tiered to the county plan. That's referenced in there. So that's part of the agreement we reach with the county to do this. So, yes.
Will the results of it have any effect on the developer down at the lower part of Grant Creek and their assessment of the lack thereof, or the definite problem we have with in and out?
Interesting you mentioned that, because we went back through the 2 years we worked on that project, and as a community. And we looked at all the public comments, and we looked at all the fire-related questions, and we put that into 4 specific areas that the Grant Creek people that live up here were concerned about. And those are the things that we built the plan off of, about what did the residents in Grant Creek do? And that's why that information came from there. That's all referenced in the document. It's all footnoted with hyperlinks to the websites for any documents or where we gather our information. It's all disclosed in there on each page. So if you're reading about one thing, you're gonna hit a link down there, it'll take you right to that source document. So we're pretty particular how we put this together.
We have a question online. Tony, you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, guys. I just want to make sure I ask a question during each section. The question I have is it possible for you to give like a 3-minute overview of the risks for, say, I mean, I think down here in Lower Grant Creek area, it's mostly grassland, but as you work your way up, it's a lot more pine foresty type. Is there an assessment that you can give at this point, or is it inappropriate and we should wait for the report to come out?
No, that's mostly pretty much public information. We took a look at it from the standpoint of what the risk was in each section of Grant Creek. And so, for instance, we broke that out. So where the Snowbowl Road cuts off of Grant Creek, everything north of Grant Creek there is in very high wildfire risk. The middle portion of Grant Creek from about Glen Eagle to the Snowbowl Road, and that area is in a high wildfire risk. The lower end is in a medium risk. But then you start looking at things like structure exposure, the number of structures exposed to fire. It's pretty much in a high risk all the way up through, because even though you're in grasslands, you get fire going in grassland, you're gonna have a high risk exposure. And we also looked at flame lengths under different fire conditions. And most of Grant Creek, if you get a serious fire going, you're going to have flame lengths that are over your head. So more than 6 feet flame lengths. Some of the upper reaches of Grant Creek depend on slope and topography and the weather during that day, the wind and everything. You can have flame lengths 25 feet and over. So it's a real eye opener when you start looking at, what we found when we started putting all these pieces together.
I appreciate that information. As a layman looking out behind my house, I see grassland and I'm like, it's not as bad as it would be up farther up, but I appreciate that, 6 feet is 6 feet. So thank you.
Yeah, and it depends where that fire starts too. There's because of the vegetation and where we're at, and we usually get westerly or southwesterly winds the majority of the year, which pushes stuff up drainages, but it also pushes fires that may start west of Grant Creek, pushes those grass fires towards the east. And if you get an east wind coming out of Hellgate Canyon, gets something started in Rattlesnake, it's going to push it into Grant Creek and maybe into Butler Creek. Those are serious fires, but we're seeing more and more extreme fire conditions because of climate change. And that's, some of us have been looking at this on the job for 50 years, so we've seen it. Yes.
If there is a fire, do they have automatic eyes in the sky or whatever detection equipment that identifies fires by, infrared signature or whatever? Is that something they use? Or is it going to be a secret for a while?
No, it's the same system.
Okay.
The best thing you can do is if you spot a fire in Grant Creek, it's called 911.
No, if nobody sees the fire yet, or what if it starts where nobody is? Does the forest, the fire, whoever the firefighting people are, do they have tools to find that before it gets big?
Yeah, well, for instance, there's technology that you can detect lightning strikes and which ones were ground strikes. Right. And that's something that's looked at, if you have a storm go overnight, that's something that's looked at every morning to see where were those ground strikes. And there will be spotter planes up looking at those locations to see if there's anything.
Follow-up question, how long would it take to get firefighting equipment to a fire once it's discovered? Say there was a fire, somewhere up Snowbowl or heading east. And, they find the fire when it's 10 acres. Oh, there's a fire there. Or maybe how long does it take for them to get there?
So it depends on couple of things, like where are your firefighting resources at? Where they're city, they're up to federal, so we identify all that in the plan.
Sure.
And we also talk about, there's two important things there. There's, so where they're located and if they're available. Because Grant Creek is not the only place that gets fires. In fact, there's hardly been any fires in Grant Creek in the last 100 years that amounted to very much size. But if you look around at the fire history in the last 20 years and look at the size of the fires, some of those fires are larger than the whole footprint of the Grant Creek watershed. And those are ones in close to Missoula.
So, but if a fire breaks out, lightning strike, windy, blows up, they can get equipment to that either from the air within a half an hour, or am I dreaming?
It might be dreaming. It depends on what else is going on, because
Okay.
you think about our fire seasons in the past, there's fire seasons already going before ours start.
Right.
And if they're really serious, like they were last year in California, and we don't have enough resources and we get a large fire, and I've seen it happen year after year, we'll sit and we will, we'll say, here's what we need. And we'll be, at the end of the day, we'll say, here's what you're gonna get, because this is all that's available. So that's, you know, just because there's a fire in Grant Creek doesn't mean that's the priority fire, even in the state. So, and there's so many variables. For instance, everybody says, well, you can get helicopters and retardant up. Well, how fast is the wind blowing? Because if it's blowing more than a certain number of miles per hour, they're not going to fly those planes, and they're certainly not going to drop retardant in water, because as soon as that comes out of the belly of that plane, the wind is just going to scatter. It'll never hit the ground. And another thing is, everybody says, well, we have smoke jumpers here. Well, smoke jumpers, they fly in the same conditions. If it's too windy, they can't fly. But you're sure not going to have a bunch of guys bailing out of a plane over a certain mile per hour wind, because you don't know where they're going to end up. So there's so many variables involved when it gets to the point of, you know, can we put people on the ground? Do we have the resources? One thing we looked at in this document is the percent of ground that is too steep to put mechanical equipment on. I think it's 45% of the land in the watershed is too steep to put any kind of equipment on. So that brings in a whole another situation about where's the fire going to come down to so you can actually get people on it. And that's why some of these fires are getting so large in these real steep drainages. So, but yeah, we've thought about a lot of stuff and a lot of questions people would ask, and we've tried to include everything possible we could put in there, and they give you a rational look at what can be done and what can be done. And then it gets back to what do you do to protect your own home before the fire ever comes? That's a big issue. Not just here, but every drainage like this around Missoula.
I mean, I care about the house, but I care about myself more.
Right.
Right? You know,
Well, I can hope your neighbor cares about it too.
well, I mean, yeah. We all care, right?
One neighbor doesn't do the mitigation steps, it puts all of your work at risk. Because you're talking exposure fires, we're talking escape routes too. It's a one way in, one way out. And so all our city, county officials and our fire community recognizes the danger that we're in up here. And so they're going to be discouraging development on these hazardous WUI areas.
Well, to a point, you know how development works. So.
Right.
I think we need to.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, guys, we got a lot going on in the neighborhood. We're fortunate to have very talented people interested in helping us, some of whom live in our neighborhood, some of whom don't. Is there anyone here who has an interest in serving on the neighborhood council leadership team or who wants to volunteer someone else who is here to serve on the council leadership team? I'll mention that there are a number of us who've been doing this for a long time. We won't be doing it forever. And if you wish to continue to have this available, we're going to have some new members on the leadership team. And unfortunately, they need to come from the areas right at the mouth of Grant Creek, at Grant Creek Village, and at the neighborhoods just south of the interstate that are in our area. More than half of the population served by our neighborhood council lives there, and none of them are here, to the best of my knowledge, and none of them are on the leadership team. It's a problem. I don't know how to solve it. And I just mentioned it, so hearing nothing, that will solve the election problem.
Well, and I will say, if anyone's interested in learning more about it, you can always email me at the neighborhoods office. It's you can find it on the neighborhoods website, missoula-neighborhoods.org. Because if you want to learn more about it or kind of want to know what it all entails, it's not too much of a commitment. Grant Creek kind of meets on an as-needed basis currently. We help create these general meetings so then we can get important information out to residents. There's a lot of things that we can do within the neighborhood, like a neighborhood grant, which was helping with the interpretive signage, things like that. So if you're ever interested, feel free to reach out.
Okay, now, because we're late, I want to give Mirtha a chance to let us know if she has any comments.
I got nothing, just kidding. Good evening, everyone. It is really nice to see a lot of you in person. And I'm glad we're meeting, in hybrid mode so I can get to know some more of you. I see a lot of familiar faces, but it's good to know you. My name is Mirtha Becerra, and I am one of 2 city council representatives for this area. I've had the privilege of representing you for almost 4 years now. And I want to say thank you to Mike and John for your presentation on fire. As some of you know, that rezone at Expo Parkway brought this issue to a really high level of importance to, at least to me, because I live here too. And, that was the message that we try to convey to city council, not successfully apparently, but, it's there. And one thing I learned is that it's not if, it's when. And so I really do appreciate the work that you're doing to ensure that we can be ready for when it happens, if it has to happen. I don't have many updates that you probably aren't aware of. One of the things I wanted to mention is the pedestrian crossing to the Bluebird that I had to step out, but I think that Bert told you about it. Whatever he said is not true. I know that in the development agreement, there are some pedestrian facilities that are planned, but I have been inquiring both Parks Department and Public Works to get them to work so that we can have something in the interim, because to me, it's really important that we have, now that we have the Bluebird open and I see a lot more people using it, that we have something put in place sooner rather than later. So please know that I am pushing for something to be done before it gets triggered by that development agreement per the development that's on Expo Parkway. I also want to say thank you for the celebration of the interpretive signs on Grant Creek. We were fortunate to have some of the elders come and share with us some of the history of this area. And thank you for the drinks on that very hot afternoon. I also want to talk about the Bluebird Trail and the little bit of easement that we have in that parking lot. I know it's of concern. I drive by it every day, so I've been raising that issue with City Parks and Recreation. They have a protocol for how they deal with some of their parking lots, This is a little bit tricky, and it's just because of that private-public relationship that we have, so there's only so much the city can do. So I stepped out and I talked to Andy, and I offer that we should meet to formulate a plan for how we can get the city to address it faster, just because of that little bit of public easement component that exists by the trailhead. So that brings me to urban camping. I know that you, like me and anyone in the community, are well aware that we're seeing a lot more people, unhoused members of the community, camping in places that they shouldn't be. I understand that we all pay property taxes in one way or another, whether you own or you rent. We're putting money into the system, and it feels unfair that sometimes we can't use some of these trails that we're all somehow paying for. I want you to know the city is acutely aware of the problem. And while there are some things that we can do, if it's a public health and safety issue, that's something that we have our local regulations that we can use. There are also a lot of things that we cannot do legally. If any of you are attorneys, you probably know Montana is part of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. There was a court ruling that says you cannot remove people from camping on public right-of-way if you cannot provide an alternative place for them to stay or a shelter. Unfortunately, we don't have any more shelters, so we cannot enforce our own regulations of no overnight camping on public land. It's a really difficult situation we're in. It cripples us legally to do anything about it until there's a new ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But please know that the city and all the different agencies that work on this issue are collaborating and trying to find a way to address the issue. One of our neighbors, who I think is a very wise man, told me today, this is not something we're going to solve, but it is something that we need to address and a challenge that we need to manage. And I want you to know the city is doing whatever we can within our legal parameters to manage the issue. But it is a big issue. It's very complex. It has mental health issues. It involves drug abuse issues. So it's not going to be easy to solve, especially if we don't have the legal instruments to deal with it. On a more positive note, I guess I could share that we are moving forward with the code reform, which is a comprehensive citywide land use plan. We have consultants that are starting to bring the first deliverables on doing a land audit, if you will, on the community to see where development should go, shouldn't go. And there's going to be a significant and robust public input. So I would really encourage you all to be there and speak about the issues that we have here in Grand Creek that limit the amount of growth and development that we can do. And finally, City Council is going to start working on our fiscal year 2024 budget. That starts in August. We get our numbers from the Department of Revenue first week in August. So that'll be what keeps the city pretty busy for those, July and August, is to ensure that we cover all the basic expenditures and we allocate the funding to all the different departments so they can continue to do what they do. So please participate if you have thoughts, which I'm sure you do, or any concerns. That would be a good time to get engaged. And all of that information will be on our city's website. So we're out of time, so I can't take any questions. I'm happy to answer questions.
I got one.
Yes.
So last year, transient pushed a grocery cart all the way up Grand Creek and camped on our parkland in our neighborhood. Does that fit in with what you just said about you can't provide them an alternative place? I mean, it's parkland, so it's not really for anybody and everybody.
It is, I mean, right now, we have people camping along the river trail, Broadway Island, McCormick Park. And those are all considered public land and public right of way where we cannot tell them you need to leave because we don't have a place to tell them to go to.
But this is parkland. HOA. HOAs.
It's private property.
That is
Let's
private.
discuss it that way.
So that's different.
It's
That's
private
different.
property.
Okay.
Yeah,
And you, as the owner, can call the police and tell the police that someone's on my property without permission.
yes.
And my experience has been that they say, he has said he will leave by Friday.
Yeah, Sheriff, I think was who they.
And then they have left, and they have left a mess. Every time this has happened, I've had a mess to clean up. But the person is gone. So I have not found it to be intractable. Snowball has an intractable problem, but I've dealt with this issue on homeowner property and on National Wildlife Federation property both, with success. By
So that's private.
But I have to be the owner. Well, in this case, I had to have the National Wildlife Federation call because I don't own the National Wildlife Federation. I just caretaker. So, but anyway, as the owner, you can call the police and say, this person is on my property without permission, and he is there. And my experience has been that the problem gets resolved.
Yeah. Anything else? I will leave my card. Please do feel free to call me. This is how I learn what I can do to better represent you. So don't hesitate to call or email me, okay? Thank you.
Both Martha and Sierra Farmer are up for election this fall. There's going to be a mayoral election this fall. It may be that we'll meet with Mullen, Captain John Mullen, and set up some opportunities for the public to meet the candidates. That's certainly a hope that I have. So I have to ask before the meeting's over, this is the important question, folks. Is there any public comment on non-agenda items? Apparently you wish to leave. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert.
Thanks, Bert.
You're welcome.
You want to? Yeah.
Yeah. We getting people.
Thanks, Mike. I won't be doing it. Well, I won't either.
I went to the wrong.